In the wild heart of the frontier, where pain was silent and mercy was rare, a woman's whisper shattered the silence, not with shame, but with truth. And when the rancher heard her words, he didn't flinch. He froze. Because sometimes, the deepest wounds aren't on the skin, they're in the soul. The sun hung low over the Blackridge Valley like a dying ember, casting long shadows across the cracked earth as the wagon rattled to a stop beside the old oak tree. Dust swirled around its wheels, settling on the boots of the two men who'd brought her, traders from Cheyenne, their faces lined with greed and whiskey, their eyes fixed on the sack of silver coins tied to their belts. Behind them, lying half-conscious in the dirt, was Lillian, Lil, Whitmore, 19 summers old, hair tangled with straw, dress torn at the hem, ribs visible beneath the thin cotton fabric. She wasn't a whore, wasn't a thief, wasn't even a runaway. She was a debt, a payment, a transaction. Her father, Reverend Silas Whitmore, no relation to the rancher, had gambled away the family farm, then sold his daughter to settle his debts, with no contract, no witness, no soul to cry foul. The traders called it a fair trade. The townsfolk called it the preacher's shame. But Lil, she called it survival. And as she lay there, blood staining her thigh, her breath shallow, she whispered 3 words that would change everything. It hurts, down there too. The air froze. The traders exchanged glances. One chuckled nervously. She's got fire, Rourke. Hope you know how to break it. But Silas didn't answer. He simply turned, walked toward the cabin, and said, "Come inside. You'll eat first. Then we'll talk." And as Lil followed him, bare feet sinking into the dry grass, she realized something terrifying. This man didn't want to break her. He wanted to understand her. And that was far more dangerous. Inside the cabin, the scent of pine resin and dried herbs couldn't mask the tension thickening the air. Lil sat on the edge of a wooden chair, arms crossed, eyes darting between the stove, the rifle leaning against the wall, and the man who owned her. Silas poured water into a tin cup, handed it to her without a word, then sat across from her, elbows on knees, fingers steepled. "Why did you say that?" he asked finally. "It hurts, down there too." "What did you mean?" She swallowed hard, the water bitter on her tongue. "I meant, whatever you came to buy. I'm not a horse, not a mule. I'm a woman. If you want me to serve you, to cook, to clean, to warm your bed, I'll do it. But don't pretend you're doing me a favor." Silas didn't react, didn't scowl, didn't reach for her, just stared at her, his storm-gray eyes holding hers like chains. "I didn't buy you to use you," he said quietly. "I bought you to save you." She blinked. "From what?" "From them," he said, nodding toward the door. "From the men who see you as property. From the world that thinks a woman's worth is measured in coin." Lil's throat tightened. No one had ever spoken to her like that. Not her father. Not the traders. Not even the preacher who'd blessed her sale with a trembling hand. "Then why did you pay?" she asked, voice barely audible. Silas leaned forward slightly. "Because someone had to. And because I knew you'd never let me touch you unless I earned it." She stared at him, searching for deception, for cruelty, for the hunger she'd seen in other men's eyes. But all she found was respect. Quiet, unshakable, terrifying respect. That night, he gave her his own bed. Slept on the floor beside it, wrapped in a blanket, rifle within arm's reach. Not to guard her, to protect her, from himself. From the world. From the truth that lingered between them. He hadn't bought her body. He'd bought her freedom. And now, he was going to give it back, to her, on her terms. The next morning, as dawn painted the sky in rose and gold, Lil stood at the window, watching him walk to the corral. He didn't look back, didn't call her name, just raised his hand in silent greeting, and for the first time in her life, she felt something she'd forgotten existed: choice. And that choice would change everything. Weeks passed like dust on the wind, quiet, steady, and full of unspoken understanding. Lil didn't become a servant. Didn't become a wife. She became something rarer, an equal. She rose before dawn to stoke the fire, not because Silas asked, but because she chose to. She mended fences, not because she had to, but because the land spoke to her in ways the city never had. She cooked meals with herbs she gathered herself, stitched torn shirts with thread spun from her own hands, and read aloud from the few books Silas kept: Frontier journals, Emerson essays, even a battered copy of Leaves of Grass hidden beneath his bunk. And Silas, he watched, listened, learned. He taught her to ride, not side saddle, but astride, legs gripping the mare like a rancher's daughter. He showed her how to track elk by the bend of a twig, how to read storm clouds like scripture, how to load a Sharp's rifle with calm precision. But he never crossed the line. Never touched her beyond a hand to steady her on a rocky slope, a nod of thanks when she passed him coffee at sunrise. The townsfolk whispered, of course. Rourke's got a woman now, they said in saloons. Paid for her like cattle. But others, the ones who'd seen the way he stood between her and a drunk at the general store, or how he'd given up his seat at church so she could sit in the shade, began to murmur something else. He didn't buy her. He freed her. Then came the day the traders returned, not with guns, but with papers. They'd sold her, yes, but the deed was unsigned. No witness. No legal claim. She's still ours, Briggs, the lead trader, sneered, spitting tobacco onto the porch. Silas didn't argue. Didn't raise his voice. He simply walked inside, returned with a leather-bound ledger, and flipped to a page dated 2 months prior. You sold her to me, he said calmly, for $200 silver. Paid in full. Witnessed by Sheriff Crow. Briggs paled. Crow's dead. Then it's your word against a dead man's, Silas replied. But I've got something better. He turned to Lil. Tell them. She stepped forward, chin high, eyes blazing. I choose to stay, she said, voice clear as a bell. Not because I'm owned. Because I'm seen. The traders left that day, tails between their legs. But the real test came that night, when Lil stood in the doorway of the cabin, moonlight spilling over her shoulders. Why did you lie? She asked. There was no ledger. No sheriff. Silas didn't deny it. I needed them to believe you were protected. Even if the law wouldn't. She stepped closer, close enough to see the scar on his temple, the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. And what about me? She whispered. Do I believe I'm protected? He met her gaze, unflinching. Only if you want to be. In that moment, the line between master and ward, buyer and bought, vanished like smoke in the wind. And something new began to grow, not in silence, but in truth. Spring came late that year, but when it did, it burst forth like a promise kept. Lil planted a garden behind the cabin, beans, squash, wildflowers, and Silas built a fence around it, not to keep her in, but to keep the deer out. They worked side by side, sweat mingling with dust, laughter rare but real. One evening, as they sat on the porch shelling peas, Lil asked the question that had burned in her chest for months, why me? You could have bought a horse. A gun. Land. Why a woman with nothing to offer? Silas didn't answer right away. He watched the sun dip below the ridge, painting the sky in amber and violet. Because I saw you, he said finally. Not the preacher's daughter. Not the debt. Just you. Standing in the dirt like you'd rather die than beg. She looked down at her hands, calloused now, strong. I was scared. So was I, he admitted. And that confession, raw and unexpected, shattered something between them. That night, during a thunderstorm that shook the pines, Lil woke to the sound of coughing, deep, wet, relentless. Silas was sick, fever burning through him, body racked with chills. She didn't hesitate. She brewed willow bark tea, soaked cloths in cold creek water, held his head as he vomited bile. For 3 days, she barely slept, barely ate, barely left his side. On the 4th morning, he opened his eyes, weak but clear. You didn't have to stay, he rasped. She handed him water, her voice steady. You paid for me. Now I'm paying you back. He almost smiled. That's not how it works. Then how does it work? She asked. He reached up, not to pull her close, but to brush a strand of hair from her forehead, his touch feather-light, respectful, final. It works when you stop thinking in debts, and start thinking in choices. And in that moment, she understood. Love wasn't transaction. It was trust. And she'd just given him hers. The wedding wasn't in a church. Wasn't witnessed by a preacher. Wasn't even planned. It happened one morning in early summer, as they stood by the creek washing linens. Lil looked up from the soap suds, saw Silas watching her with an expression she couldn't name, tenderness, maybe, or quiet awe, and said, if I asked you to marry me, would you say yes? He didn't laugh, didn't hesitate, just set down the shirt he was wringing out, walked to her, and took her hands in his, rough, warm, steady. I'd say I've been waiting for you to ask. They stood before the old oak tree that marked the edge of Blackridge, exchanged vows they wrote themselves, and sealed it with a kiss that tasted of soap, sweat, and something deeper, peace. No rings. No guests. Just two souls who'd found each other in the wreckage of the world and decided to build something new. Word spread, of course. Some called it scandalous. Others called it brave. But those who knew them, the trapper who left pelts on their porch, the widow who brought bread, the boy Silas taught to ride, called it right. Years later, travelers would pass through the valley and ask about the rancher who bought a woman and made her his wife. But the locals would smile and point to the garden, now overflowing with beans and sunflowers, to the cabin with smoke curling from its chimney, to the woman reading to children on the porch. He didn't make her his wife, they'd say. She made him her husband. And on quiet nights, when the wind blew just right, you could still hear the echo of her voice in the pines, not pleading, not bargaining, but declaring, "It hurts, down there too." And he listened, not with pity, not with lust, but with love, and in that silence, she finally healed.